Welcome to Entry Point Faith. Join us each week to discover fresh meaning in the world and find faith your way. Now, here is Pastor Nancy Lafferty.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929. He was a Baptist minister and an activist. He was the most visible spokesperson and the leader of the civil rights movement, which successfully protested racial discrimination in federal and state laws. Inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent teachings of Gandhi, King led the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, organized the nonviolent 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama, and organized the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. On October 14th, 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial injustice and inequality through nonviolent resistance. In 1965, he helped organize the Selma to Montgomery marches, and then he turned his attention to Chicago to work on segregated housing. In his final years, he expanded his focus to include opposition to poverty and the Vietnam War. He was planning a national occupation of Washington, D.C., to be called the Poor People's Campaign, when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. Today, as we honor and celebrate this man and his legacy, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. How do we, in 2023, look at this legacy and the impact that he made and the issues that he addressed over 50 years ago? And we have to say, have we made any progress? Are things better, or are they about the same, or even worse than they were during King's lifetime of activism? Has Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream come true yet? Now, let's be very real about something, ladies and gentlemen, this morning. We are a predominantly white faith community. As a result, this is a potentially uncomfortable moment. No matter how woke we may think we are, as aware as we are of inequality and racial tension, there are those of us who are white will never have an idea about what it means to be a person of color in our country or in the world. I will never struggle with injustice and inequality the same way that people of color do. But I can't stand by and pretend like everything is okay, and I don't think you want to either. Now, when I went to school, as I suspect many of you, every single morning of every single school day, we stood up, we pushed our chairs in, we turned, we faced the flag, we put our hand over our heart, and we said, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Now, those were just a jumble of words that I raced through when I was in elementary school. We tried to say it as fast as we could. But when I was in high school, our government teacher took time to go over what we were actually saying. I will never forget the debate that took place in that class in the spring of 1969, my senior year of high school, just 1 year after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. The debate was about that line, "and justice for all." Our teacher was challenging us to consider whether or not we as a nation had achieved justice for all. We concluded, of course, that justice for all had not yet occurred. And here we are, 54 years after that debate took place, still unable to say that we have achieved justice for all. We are all familiar with these words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But we may not be familiar with the words he said right after that. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Of the many, many things that I adore about this man, his ability to string words together was phenomenal. Tied in a single garment of destiny. What a profound image. These words remind us we all have a responsibility to take a stand when we witness injustice. Race relations is certainly the most important issue facing many of our world citizens right now. What can Entry Point do to improve race relations? What can Entry Point as a faith community do to alleviate injustice, inequality? In the Old Testament book of Micah, we are guided with these words. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness? Do justice and love kindness. Now, in order to help us do justice, I'm going to clarify a few words that we hear all the time when we talk about these kinds of issues. There is such power and yet such potential for misunderstanding in the words that we use. The 4 words we're going to talk about today, ladies and gentlemen, are inequality, equality, equity, and justice. So look at this slide. In the upper left corner of the screen, we see 2 people with hands out, hoping for an apple to drop from the tree. Inequality shows us that the tree is leaning away from one of the people and toward the other. An apple has dropped down toward one of the people. And inequality here is described as unequal access to opportunities. Now, just below that image on the bottom left, we see a demonstration of equality. Both people are standing on ladders, attempting to pick apples. The ladders are the same height, but the tree is still leaning away from one person and toward the other. Equality here is defined as evenly distributed tools and assistance. In the upper right of the screen, things have changed considerably. Because the tree is still leaning away from one person, that person has a taller ladder. And that allows that person to be able to reach the tree and pick apples. This image is labeled equity. And it is defined as custom tools that identify and address inequality. In the bottom right image, we see far more things. We see both people are standing back on similar height ladders, but the tree is no longer leaning toward one person and away from the other. It has been propped up so that it is standing up straight. This image represents justice, and it is defined this way: fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. I think you can see where we're going with this. If there is nothing else that we learn today and think about today, let's try to embrace these very clear images that use those 4 terms very clearly. I know we're not going to solve those issues today. But we must commit to solving the problem of unfair treatment. We must remain intolerant of racism. We must do whatever we can do to educate ourselves, to sensitize ourselves to elements of our speech or our attitudes which might unknowingly exude racism. We must take time to truly examine our own hearts. For me, that's the hope that exists. I believe that people generally and genuinely want fairness and kindness for people. I know that some homes raise up hatred and intolerance of anyone who is different. Intolerance of people of color, intolerance of people who are not like them. And I don't know how to fix that. There is no vaccine for that. But I do know how to encourage voices that are loving and aware, and encourage those voices to be louder and stronger, to be brave and honest and fair-minded. I believe the very best way to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today is to keep working, or to get working, to fix the problem of racial injustice across the globe for all people. Sometimes that means we have to stand up or speak up and say things that might make other people uncomfortable. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. None of us can rest until we all have justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, how does their injustice bother me? How does that threaten my justice? Great question. Martin Niemöller was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany. In the 1920s and the early 1930s, he sympathized with many Nazi ideals, and he supported radically right-wing political movements. But after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Niemöller became an outspoken critic of Hitler. He spent the last 8 years himself under Nazi rule in Nazi prisons, concentration camps. Although he was a victim of Nazi persecution, he publicly confessed his inaction and his indifference to the fate of many other Nazi victims when in 1946 he went on a lecture circuit and he spoke against the Nazi regime. We know him best as the author of these words. First, they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, but I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. This is not Nazi Germany. I know that, and I'm not suggesting that it is. But in a similar vein, none of us can afford to stand by and allow mistreatment, racism, injustice, and inequity to continue. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. May we do justice and love kindness. Amen.
Thanks for listening in on this week's discussion on Entry Point Faith. You can join the Entry Point Faith community in person every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana. For more information and a transcript of Nancy's messages, visit entrypointonline.org. Entry Point Faith is brought to you in partnership with mypodcast.media.